Welcome to State of Play. I'm Will Todman, Chief of Staff of the Geopolitics and Foreign Policy Department at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. In this podcast, we bring together our leading experts to unpack the latest geopolitical developments from around the world and what it all means. So on Tuesday, President Trump said that the US military has conducted strikes on a third Venezuelan boat in the Caribbean. And the White House has said these vessels were carrying evil Tren de Aragua narco-terrorists, referring to the Venezuelan gang. And over the past month, the US has ratcheted up its military presence in the southern Caribbean as part of this crackdown on drug smugglers. Nicolas Maduro of Venezuela has said this is US aggression. He said there's no communication between the US and Venezuelan governments anymore, and he's accused the US of seeking regime change. He's also called up thousands of reservists, saying that he's preparing for an invasion. So what's the US actually trying to achieve in Venezuela? What clues can we glean from the current military deployments? What might this mean for domestic politics in Venezuela? And ultimately, can US pressure achieve its aims? So today, I am joined by Ryan Berg and Mark Cancian. So our listeners will remember Ryan Berg is the director of our Americas program and also the head of the Future of Venezuela initiative. Ryan, last time you had some jokes about Russians and Windows, I think loosely connected to a recommendation for what Sergei Lavrov should try of Brazilian food. But I think you're unable to give him any recommendations for Venezuelan food because you can't go there. Is that correct?
The embassy has said that I would be wise not to travel to Venezuela, given what the initiative has said about the Maduro regime. So I'll take their advice, stay away from Venezuela. Okay. That way you don't have a CSIS employee as a political prisoner in Caracas.
That's probably a good thing. And
well, fortunately, we have a naval task force in the area that might be able to bail you out.
There is
that's in extremis.
Some potential amphibious ships, potential amphibious landing out there from some of the ships that could come to my rescue.
Excellent. We can talk about this. Maybe that's what they're there for. So then Colonel Mark Cancian is a senior advisor with the CSIS Defense and Security Department. Mark, you are our first guest from the DSD department. Is it about to become WSD? Are we now War and Security Department? Or
We've actually had that discussion.
Oh, really? Okay.
Oh, yes. And the consensus was we were going to stay with Department of Defense until Congress legislates a different name. Now, internally, they call themselves the Department of War, but externally, It's still Department of Defense.
Okay. And Mark, you lead a lot of CSIS's most prominent war games. And I know you just put out a piece that tracks the military deployments in the Caribbean, which we will link in the show notes. So I'm really excited to dive into that. And maybe we can start there. So for those listeners and me who don't track the deployment of military assets as closely as you do, how new is what we're seeing in the Southern Caribbean at the moment?
The big thing that's new is the use of lethal force. There have been U.S. counter-drug efforts in the Caribbean for decades. Most of it is done by the Coast Guard, but the Navy has been involved in the past. Also, they put detachments from the Coast Guard on board Navy ships to handle the law enforcement aspects. The United States has conducted large military operations in the Caribbean area. There was the invasion of Grenada in 1983, there was Panama in 1989, there was Haiti in, I think, 1994. So that part is not unusual. But the use of lethal force is unusual. The Coast Guard will attempt to stop any drug runners. If there's resistance, they will try to disable the boat. They try to avoid using lethal force. But here, the president has decided to use lethal force without any preliminaries, without any review. They're on pretty sketchy ground legally, since many people accuse this of being a summary execution. What we are seeing is a reflection of Secretary Hegseth's policy on the use or non-use of lawyers in operational matters. Before coming into office, he was very critical about lawyers, saying that they slowed down the process and kept the operating forces from attacking worthwhile targets. So he has taken them out of decision-making. Here, what we saw was a decision made based on intelligence and then the political officials.
Ren, I want to talk a bit about the link to Venezuela here, because President Trump said that Maduro is directing Tren de Aragua. But there was a U.S. intelligence assessment from May that said Maduro is probably not cooperating with the cartel. Does this look like a really new approach to Venezuela for the U.S. to be using lethal force against these boats?
Well, as Mark said, it's a new approach, the lethality of the deployment. But I think the idea that Nicolás Maduro is connected to criminal organizations, that a lot of drugs pass through Venezuela, that Venezuela has a lot of narco money circulating in it, that's not new. And that's been a bipartisan consensus in Washington for a long time. In fact, just to put in a bit of a shameful plug, Will, for our program back in 2018 was one of the first think tanks to begin referring to Maduro as a criminal regime, because we were looking at the sources of his income. And we realized that there was far more on the illicit side than on the licit side, especially after U.S. sanctions on PDVSA, on the oil in Venezuela. And so he's shifted a lot of his focus into allowing Colombian cocaine to pass through and using institutions of the state to help do that. What is different, as Mark said, is the scale of the deployment and the lethality of the deployment. 1989, 1994, these are the last times we've seen force posture of this nature in Southcom. Southcom AOR is usually a pretty sleepy COCOM, and we've now got this pretty unprecedented buildup for at least my generation of folks who are watching this part of the world. And interestingly, we have the reopening of some long-closed naval bases, Air Force bases in places like Puerto Rico. They're now operating again on short notice. Most importantly, I would say Roosevelt Roads, which was decommissioned in 2004. So it's interesting to see some of those installations active once again and open as part of this deployment.
Interesting. And Mark, based on your tracking of these military assets, what do you think these deployments are meant to achieve?
Let me go in descending order.
Okay.
The first thing is to intercept vessels that are considered to be carrying illegal drugs. Of course, there appear to have been 3 such interceptions. I'm sure we'll see more. Stepping down, you could see attacks on cartel facilities in Venezuela, maybe in rural areas. The president has mentioned that could happen, and the United States has the capabilities to do that. Stepping down further, you could see attacks on the Maduro regime. I'm going to leave it to Ryan to talk about the implications of that and how likely it is. U.S. military does have the capability to do that, but of course they are a sovereign nation, unlike the cartels. I think it's unlikely that you will see any boots on the ground. People speculate about soft raids and landings by the Marines. There are only 2,000 Marines. So I think any boots on the ground, because of the risk of capture, risk of having a helicopter shot down, very unlikely. And then,
can you give me how many would we be seeing if there was really a ground invasion coming? What kinds of numbers, roughly speaking, would we be talking about?
We hypothesized about 50,000.
Okay. Oh, wow.
And although there's no set number, you would need something on that order. And that's why an invasion is out of question with the current forces. Now,
just for context, the invasion of Panama in 1989, which Mark mentioned in his previous response, Operation Just Cause, I think we used just short of 30,000 in that invasion. And Panama should be noted as a country about 10 times smaller than Venezuela, much less complex in terms of the territorial terrain, criminal organizations that are operating there, some of the forces that would, of course, be fighting back.
Right. And Venezuela, at least on paper, has something like 123,000 members in its armed forces, and then some reservists, a much more demanding operation. Could be north of 50,000. The Pentagon likes to be assured of success. So I wouldn't be surprised if the Joint Staff were putting out numbers like 200,000, 300,000. But in any case, it's way more than what we have there right now. That's why I say this is not a preparation for an invasion. If there were invasion, you'd see a lot more activity.
Can I just add to what Mark said in terms of some of the goals of this? I think we've been looking at this as well from the strategic priorities of the DoD. I haven't gotten around to calling it the DOW yet, much like Mark. There's some macro messaging here that's very important as well. There was an article in Politico now a week and a half ago, which had a scoop on the National Defense Strategy document. And it said, again, this is rumor, but it said that the Western Hemisphere was going to take priority, that the document was going to say that no region of the world matters more to U.S. homeland security than the Western Hemisphere, even more so than systemic competition, long-term systemic competition with the PRC. It's a pretty juicy headline, right? And if that is in fact the case, there's a lot of macro messaging here on the importance and reprioritization of homeland defense and the Western Hemisphere. You're literally seeing the administration taking destroyers that were previously on counter-Houthi missions, for example, like the Dunham, and bringing them to the Western Hemisphere. So that's an important message. Second, I think the administration wants to shift the known narco-trafficking routes in the Southern Caribbean. A few displays of lethal force, as has been seen in those videos. I imagine those videos are circulating throughout Signal and WhatsApp groups of various trafficking organizations, and folks are deciding if they are going to take to the water, to take a different route, or to sit at home for a couple more weeks and try to wait this thing out. I think there's a bunch of freedom of navigation concerns that we could get into with Venezuela's harassment of Guyana over the years, and the fact that Guyana recently had an election, quite fortunately uninterrupted by any antics from the Maduro regime, and I imagine the force posture had something to do with that. And then I think something that's been underreported on is the sort of omnidirectional messaging that this deployment has had and the lethality of some of the strikes. So there's a message for Venezuela. We've been talking about that. I think there's a message for Panama in there as well. One of the destroyers, the USS Lake Erie, transited the Panama Canal in order to get into its final position in the Caribbean. Message sent on the importance of navigation through the Panama Canal, which has been another one of the Trump administration's priorities. There are messages there for Colombia, which has just been decertified on drug cooperation. There are messages there for Mexico on the credibility of Trump's threats of kinetic strikes.
Can we go back to Venezuela, though? What are the messages for the Maduro regime? What do you think he is hearing from, or what message is he receiving from all of this?
Well, I think that the message of regime change is a good one for him to play on politically. As Mark said, and I agree entirely, this is not a regime change operation. I see no indications that it is, and the president has said regime change is messy. We're not looking at that right now. If, however, something were to happen internally, such that the armed forces were forced to reconsider their loyalty, or a strike on Venezuelan soil, for example, without many casualties, let's say it took out a port or some area that was known as an embarkation point for trafficking, and something were to happen from that, I don't think that the United States would shed any tears about seeing Maduro leave. But I think that the messaging that he's been given from the administration so far is that this is about his connection to illicit groups. Mm-hmm. And this is about defending the homeland. He's playing up, of course, the regime change element, the message, because it plays well for him domestically, and it allows him to be the victim.
Let me jump in and reinforce something that Ryan said, which is about the national defense strategy and what we hear about that. And we've heard from many sources that homeland security and hemispheric security will be at the top, and other demands like China, Europe will be lower down. Europe, much lower
Way
down.
Lower.
And this is possibly a big change. The reason I say possibly is that Homeland Security has been at the top of the list ever since 9/11. So every administration says Homeland Security is the most important. Hemispheric security is an addition, goes a little further. And how that gets defined will be very important for the Department of Defense. And we're waiting for the National Defense Strategy to come out to get a sense about whether this is going to be a major force driver, whether it's going to be a major driver of capabilities, or whether this is a more of a political signal and a policy issue than an actual force structure demand. If the United States wanted to continue to have a large naval presence in the Caribbean, that would stretch naval forces. Long term, the solution is to beef up the Coast Guard. They're much better equipped to handle this kind of mission.
Mm-hmm. I'd be interested in hearing from Mark on if there are any signs that he would be looking at to see whether the U.S. actually does shift its priorities to the Western Hemisphere. If the document in fact says that, what would be the things that you're looking at? Because I look at Southcom and I see there's an unfunded wish list every year at Southcom of about $300 million or so. It's a lot of money that's not being funded. So what are some of the things that you'd look at if you were to actually determine whether a true shift in priorities is taking place?
There are a couple of things. The first is whether, for example, this group of ships is replaced. When particular ships need to go back to home port, whether some other ship comes out to replace them, or whether we see something like what we saw in Los Angeles with land forces. That is, after this initial surge, then the forces disperse and they aren't replaced. The political message was made. The other thing is about the bases in the region, and I think it's highly likely that some of those will stay open. Rosie Roads was closed, but now is back open, and there were a number of facilities on Puerto Rico that could be expanded. Southcom, as Ryan says, has been a backwater for many, many years. They have essentially no forces assigned to them. They're probably thrilled to get this much attention. They haven't had this attention since the 1990s. So watching for bases and a continuous presence as opposed to a one-time presence.
So I do want to bring us back to the main question then of what can this all achieve? You've, I think, talked about the different kinds of military options that could be pursued, including expanding to strikes on cartels in Venezuela and whatnot. But do you both think, can this show of force and these deployments actually fundamentally shift the drug smuggling networks and stop them? Or is it way too early to tell if this could actually achieve its stated aims?
Let me talk about the military side now. Let Ryan talk about more the law enforcement and the drug flows in general. There's no question that these task forces, and it's not just the naval ships, but there are aircraft. Apparently, there are some MQ-9 Reapers being sent to the Caribbean. So they have fair amount of surveillance over the area, but the Caribbean's a large area, and you can't spot every drug runner. So they can take out drug runners here and there. They can't stop drug running, but that's never been the goal of any counter-drug effort. The goal has been to impose such a penalty on the system that it collapses. Now, I'm not sure that that's going to happen here, but they can make life difficult for the cartels.
So I would say that the biggest goal of this deployment is actually to signal that there's a shifting paradigm in how we do security in the region. The Secretary of State said it himself at his recent stops in Mexico and Ecuador about a week and a half ago. Interdiction hasn't worked the way we used to do it with the Coast Guard, as Mark was describing. We ask for vessels to stop. If they don't stop, we shoot out their motors. We search and seize things that are on boats. That doesn't work because cartels basically build in about a 2 to 3, maybe 4% loss in product, and the rest they can reasonably expect gets through. What they are asserting that works is the lethality of these strikes. The other message that they're sending is that these are now foreign terrorist organizations. These are not TCOs. These are not criminal organizations.
So TCO?
Transnational Criminal Organization.
Thank you.
Sorry. And so that the FTO, the Foreign Terrorist Organization designation, is not just rhetoric. It has meaning. And the way that we deal with these organizations is completely different. And so that's one thing. I think it's really difficult to shift incentives for cartels. It's far easier to shape and shift incentives for states where cartels are active. And one of the things that U.S. Foreign policy and security cooperation has had trouble with over the years is this credibility issue. So I think a lot of this is about credibility, showing that the kinetic force, the kinetic strikes are real, and continuing to get as many countries in the region as we can cooperating with us, lest something else be the sort of method that we take. Temporarily, I think we can shift trafficking patterns with some of these lethal strikes. Like I said, I think those videos are circulating in a lot of WhatsApp and Signal groups, but the medium and long term remains to be seen.
And are there any signs that that regional piece is beginning to have an effect? Are we seeing any other states in the region start to shift their approach to narcotics smuggling and whatnot? Or is it too early for that?
To my great surprise, Will, actually, this kind of force posture and force deployment you would expect to garner quite a bit of criticism from Latin America. I think those who are critical of it have been relatively quiet, except for Petro and Colombia. And there have been some countries that are overly supportive of it or very expressive. A number of countries in the Caribbean, Guyana, Trinidad, Jamaica have been very supportive. While the deployment has been in place, Peru, the Dominican Republic, Paraguay, Argentina, Ecuador, all those countries have declared Nicolás Maduro to be a criminal regime. They've declared the Cartel de los Soles and the Tren de Aragua to be foreign terrorist organizations, just like the United States. So I think from the administration's perspective, they look at that panorama and they say, we're harmonizing, we're synchronizing, we're actually bringing partners into our efforts with this deployment. And I think there is a positive feedback loop there for the administration.
It's really interesting. Okay, so let me now turn to our quick fire round of questions. So as ever, we have the same three. So firstly, please can you sum up the state of US pressure on Venezuela in one word?
I think we're going to have the same word.
Oh.
Mine is intimidation.
Okay.
And that's because the force there clearly is aimed at making the Maduro regime nervous. We've got Marines, and people talk about, Marines, they can land, they can invade, but of course it's way too small. But
yeah,
the notion of threat there, I think, is very important.
Okay.
I'm going to abuse your rules, Will, and use two words.
Uh-oh.
Maximum pressure.
Okay.
And this was the description that the administration gave of their approach to Venezuela in the first term. But now we see that they're taking it further. And so I would argue this is actually maximum pressure. What we saw in the first term, just with the use of diplomatic and economic tools like sanctions, didn't get us to actual maximum pressure.
Okay. I don't think we've mentioned Russia today, but we have mentioned China as it relates to the changing national defense strategy. But of the US, China, and Russia, who is up and who's down the most this week? And you can define this either generally speaking about the globally, or as it relates to the Southern Caribbean and Venezuela.
For the last week, the United States clearly had a very, very bad week, and that was because of the assassination of Charlie Kirk. And the implications for perhaps increased political violence in the United States, and now the pushback against First Amendment rights in order to suppress criticism. That's very disturbing. Russia had a pretty good week in the sense that they got through another week of war in Ukraine, which they believe they are winning without interference from the United States.
Let me take a slightly contrarian view to Mark, because we like debate on this podcast. I think China and Russia are down, the U.S. is up, or could be seen as down and the U.S. up, only from the perspective of the sort of axis of authoritarians, or what we here at CSIS are calling the crinks. The axis doesn't look so supportive of one of its allies in Venezuela at this point in time. Maduro is certainly firmly ensconced still in power, but increasingly isolated. And China and Russia have said relatively little about the U.S. deployment, to my surprise. Okay.
It's now time for your bugbears. And Ryan, this is your last opportunity for a little while to to ban people from using a phrase, because you have got a Council on Foreign Relations fellowship and will be joining government for a year. So before you go,
joining the Department of War and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, I'll actually be working on these issues that we were talking about today. In fact, probably on Venezuela. So
congratulations.
Thank you.
What do you want to ban before you leave?
Ooh, On the last podcast, we decided amid rising geopolitical tensions, both Henrietta and I agreed that was an awful phrase, overwrought, overused. Just about every single article has that. And I'm actually sticking with that because since we identified that on the last State of Play podcast I was featured in, I've seen it again and again in a number of articles, and I'm still annoyed by it.
Not on State of Play, I hope.
No.
Yeah.
We've learned our lesson. The lesson is for others to learn, Will.
How about you, Mark?
I would ban unprecedented because it represents, for many writers, a lack of understanding of history, and talk about unprecedented counter-drug efforts. Well, the United States has been doing drug efforts, counter-drug, for a long time. As we've said, it's the lethal part that is unprecedented. The more general operational activities, have lots of precedence. And I agree with your banning of rising tensions. And I'll tell a funny story to end our podcast.
Please.
At Thanksgiving, the family gathers after having, eaten themselves into near unconsciousness and makes predictions about the coming year. Well, one year, my younger son predicted turmoil in the Middle East. It was disallowed as a prediction because there had been turmoil in the Middle East for 5,000 years, and it wasn't about to stop. So I agree that these general, about tensions, need to be forbidden.
Note how genteel Mark is. He waited until the very end to implicitly criticize my use of the word unprecedented.
Well, I think I probably said it too. I think I did.
Unprecedented buildup. At least I gave some historical references since 1989, since 1994. Nevertheless.
Okay. So to wrap up then, so you have explained that lethal force is new. Not unprecedented, perhaps, but it's new in this for these kinds of operations. And I think, Mark, you walked through the range of military options that the US has, but said that you are not seeing really any signs that the US is actually preparing for an invasion of Venezuela, as Maduro likes to say. Ryan, you talked about the way that this is part of a shifting paradigm, and that this is designed to signal this much greater focus on the Western Hemisphere, which we're likely to see in the national defense strategy if the rumors are correct. This is a more muscular use of US force in this part of the world. Referring to these cartels as foreign terrorist organizations is new. Mark, you've pointed out some signs to watch for. So you've said, do these ships remain there after this initial surge? Will the bases remain reopened? Those are things that we'll be watching out for. But ultimately, on what the US can achieve here, that we'll see on the military side, we'll see successes here and there. It will probably disrupt these drug running routes, but very hard to stop them completely. But I think, Ryan, you said it's difficult to really shift the incentives for cartels, but already the US is seeing a real harmonizing with lots of its partners across Latin America, and very little criticism of this so far. So we will keep watching this. Thank you so much to you both for joining today. I learned a lot and very grateful for your time. Good luck in your next position, Ryan.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for having us on the program.
Thank you. Thanks for listening to State of Play. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to it wherever you heard it. And you can find more analysis at www.csis.org/geopolitics. Until next time.